And with that, we'll begin. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining and welcome to today's event, Israeli Military Refusers with the Green Olive Collective and the Refuser Solidarity Network. My name is Erez Bleicher, and I'm the Advocacy and Membership Director of the Green Olive Collective, an advocacy, human rights, and tour guiding center committed to a democratic future and an end to the ongoing displacement of Palestinians. We provide communities around the world with insight into the apartheid policies of the occupation and the resources to engage in meaningful advocacy in solidarity with Palestinians. Your contributions for today's event will be split between the Green Olive Collective and the Refuser Solidarity Network and go to sustain both of our work to challenge militarism, occupation, supremacy, and segregation. We need contributions from you, our wider community, in order to cover the costs of this event and sustain our work amplifying the voices of Palestinian and Israeli human rights defenders calling for a permanent ceasefire and the end of collective punishment in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. You can donate at greenolivetours.com/contributions, which I just put into the chat moments ago. Today, we are joining with the Refuser Solidarity Network to learn about the network of military refusers, conscientious objectors, and draft resistors currently defying forced military conscription in Israel. Since 2003, the Refuser Solidarity Network has amplified the voices of Israeli conscientious objectors and provided them with critical services. Their activities include jail support, legal fees, media campaigns, and educational programs for Israeli and global audiences about their important resistance to occupation. Since the latest assault on Gaza began, a growing number of teenage objectors have refused compulsory conscription into the Israeli army and served time in military prison. Many of them are active in feminist refuser solidarity networks critical of militarism, state violence, patriarchy, and the ongoing Nakba. I'm very glad that today we are joining with two longtime members of this movement who have worked to support this new wave of draft resistors. Atalia Benaba is the social media coordinator of the Refuser Solidarity Network and administers the page of Voices Against War. She publicly refused military service in 2017 and spent 110 days in military prison. Since then, she has been active in solidarity accompaniment, protective presence, and co-resistance efforts in the Jordan Valley, South Hebron Hills, and Jerusalem. Sahar Bardi is a human rights defender whose activism began as a member of Anarchists Against the Wall, supporting the popular struggle of Palestinians in Area C. She is known for her participation in a variety of organizations, including the American Friends Service Committee, Free Jerusalem, and other initiatives challenging unbridled militarism in Israeli society. In 2008, she served 3 prison sentences for her refusal to be conscripted into the Israeli military. Atalia and Sahar, thank you so much for being with us today. It's sincerely appreciated, and we're really honored to have you both. The last thing I'll say before beginning our conversation is that everyone from this point on should please feel free to ask questions in the chat as Sahar and Natalia speak and share with us. Just please be sure to begin the comment in the chat with question followed by a colon or dash so I know to look for it, and hopefully I can integrate it into our Q&A at the end of this hour. And with that, sincere thanks again, Sahar and Natalia. I'll ask you both to start by introducing yourself, of course, and ask you to tell us how you first began to develop the political consciousness that led you to refuse mandatory conscription in the Israeli military. What experiences led you to join Israeli civil resistance movements, working in solidarity with Palestinians and in opposition to the ongoing Nakba? Atalia, would you like to begin? You should be able to unmute yourself.
Yes. So hello, thank you for having me. Happy to meet you all. So I, as mentioned, I was a refuser. I refused to serve. I became a conscientious objector when I was 18. And I think for me, refusing was a big step in becoming an anti-occupation activist, in sort of taking responsibility in this struggle against oppression. But it did start before. I grew up in Jerusalem, very close to like East Jerusalem. I spent a lot of my childhood in East Jerusalem, so I think I always had sort of a different conception of what the space looks like. For me, Palestinians were always a part of the space and a part of the city. And growing up, I learned more about the fact that there is an occupation and there is oppression because it's not something you know unless somebody insists on sort of opening your eyes to it. And for me, it was my brother who insisted that I know there is an occupation, and he took me to tours. And with him, I developed my sort of like political thinking and the understanding that I have the ability to act against it and to oppose it. And when I had to make a decision, or in Israel there's like mandatory conscription. So the hegemony or like the general idea is that this is not a decision; you have to enlist. But for me, I had the privilege of knowing people who chose to not enlist, and through that, I knew that I can make a choice, and the choice to refuse was the choice to do something publicly that allows me to make a public statement against what I see as unjust.
Thanks, Natalia. Much appreciated. And I do think the first time I met you, I'm not sure if you remember this, was in Bil'in at one of the Friday demonstrations shortly before I believe you refused. Um, so
Yeah.
seeing how things have developed and the work that you and others continue to do is incredible. And yes, Saha, would you like to also introduce yourself and share how you arrived to these communities?
Sure. So, Sahar, I'm from Jerusalem. I think Atalia and I were both very lucky to have, in different ways, kind of family members leading us into this process. For me, it was during the Second Intifada, the early 2000s. Um, while I grew up in a house that even before that was kind of against the occupation. I just didn't know what the occupation was. It was just a concept that was floating around, as obviously we're against it. But then in the Second Intifada and the realities, kind of really just knocking on your door, almost literally, it. I think for many people it was a bit of a wake up call, and my father was included in those people. He did refuses military service and his reserve service in the first Intifada, but wasn't very political about it, wasn't public about it. But by the second Intifada, I kind of felt that there is a need to publicly speak about things. And in many ways, I was very lucky because my teenage years were, part of them was already joining into activities in solidarity with Palestinians. The very first experiences were kind of very, nice, quiet days that one would bring their children along to, of planting olive trees and those kind of things in different Palestinian communities. And there I started understanding what that word meant, right? That concept of occupation. And part of that was seeing different colors of ID between myself and the people that I met. And part of it was just speaking to kids my age. I was 12, 13 at the time. So speaking to kids my age and understanding the difference of realities for them that are not, big headlines and kind of dramatic stories that we hear of occupation. They're the fact that they can't invite friends from school over to their village because their village has its own private checkpoint that only people from the village are allowed in or out. And really the only thing they cared about was the fact that they can't invite friends over. And it's just like all these different ideas of what occupation is and the different levels that it affects you on the most daily things, and also understanding within that my privilege, right? It's not just understanding other people's occupation, it's also understanding my privileged position within that. And I think a lot of breaking of a lot of the narratives that were around me at the time. Again, Second Intifada, a lot of the realities around us was suicide bombings, was this, and the mainstream media, the discourse around it was that the only way to deal with this is big military operations and the building of the wall. And at the time, it was just the beginning of building the wall, the fence in different areas. And again, that the narrative was this is there to protect us, right? This was kind of what I was hearing. But then you would actually go and see where that fence was being built and how it's separating between one Palestinian village and another. And this whole, the narrative just comes crumbling down. So I think for me, that was kind of the general process. And through that, I started going to different protests at the time against the wall and fence as those were developing and coming into that situation where, you were taught your whole life that Palestinians are trying to kill you and that soldiers are there to protect you. And then you come to a protest in which soldiers are shooting you and Palestinians are offering you shelter and it doesn't fit. So yeah, that I think was a lot of my process, and therefore by the time I was supposed to join the military or be drafted, it was very obvious to me that that's not an option. I mean, the idea of being shot by soldiers one day and then joining their ranks the other seemed as ridiculous as it sounds when I say it that way. And so that's kind of where brought me to that decision.
Thanks. And I think both of you, in different ways, powerfully highlighted themes like using one's privilege against itself, against the systems that grant you unfairly that privilege, and taking collective responsibility by making personal decisions not to participate in these larger structures of violence. Things that are important and relevant, of course, today in the world, wherever we are, and that there's a lot to learn and discuss about. Getting beyond the experiences and communities that led to your general political awareness and towards the moments where you refused, I want to ask each of you a little bit more specifically about that process when it did arrive. When did you refuse conscription into the Israeli military, and what was the process before, during, and after? How does the process of conscription, refusal, military prison, and release function logistically? And what was your experience as a refuser? Though, of course, there isn't the time now to explore every facet. Natalia, do you want to share a few thoughts?
Yes. So for me, one of the difficulties that I had with making a decision was that I was a part of a youth movement, Shomer Asayir, that I've been a part of for like sort of all of my teenage life. I was there since I was 9 maybe, and I was a counselor, and I did this year of like social service or something like that after high school. And I lived in a commune with 16 other people. And the idea was that we would all enlist together. And we had these seminars sort of talking about enlisting together and what will we do in the army. And it was sort of this like Zionist left wing movement where they had this idea of changing the system from within and having like, sort of trying to make society better. And for me, these seminars were really complicated because I didn't want to become a soldier. I would imagine myself, not being able to live with myself if I became a soldier. But I felt this sense of responsibility. And refusing really gave me a solution for that in a way, because it gave me the option of being someone who has this like social effect or like social view of what I should do, and not only me myself. I don't want to become a soldier. And in these seminars with this like group of friends, I would talk about it, and it really gave me actually a space to sort of figure out what I want to do. But ultimately, like, I was kicked out of the youth movement in a way. Like the moment that everyone enlisted, it was like, okay, yeah, I can still stay. It doesn't matter. Like this youth movement is not about the military. But in all actuality, once my group enlisted, it became impossible to remain friends. And I also became like very active, especially in the Georgian Valley. I would go there a lot, and as Sarah mentioned, I would have these like sort of experiences that really changed my worldview regarding what are soldiers and what is the state and what is the law. Sort of seeing the way that Palestinians are facing settlers and cops and soldiers without anyone, on their side and without any protection, and seeing the impunity in which, with which the settlers enact violence, and seeing the soldiers standing by or assisting them. And it really made me feel a great distance from everyone my age that I knew that enlisted. And I had this period of time that they were already in the army. I didn't refuse yet, and I was having all these new experiences. And then when I refused, it was, all about that, because you enter prison, and the way it works is that you refuse, and then they give you sort of a month in prison because they can't give you more, and then they tell you need to come back and refuse again. So it's this very long process. And for me, it was 4 months. Yeah.
Thanks, Natalia. And I guess to touch a little bit more on that, because I think many people around the world, understandably, aren't familiar with the Israeli military system, the way that recruitment and conscription operates. So when you say refuse, what does that mean? Is there a letter that you send? Is there a draft day where you publicly announce? What are the dynamics? What does that actually look like for you personally? Of course, you can speak to most, but in general, I think a lot of people around the world just don't have a sense of what the actual process is.
Yeah. So you have just a conscription date. And I think the beauty with refusing is that you don't have to do anything beforehand. You can just come and be like, hi, I will not enlist. If you want to sort of get out of military conscriptions in other ways, you'll have to do this bureaucratic process. For example, if you want to get an exemption through our conscience committee, then you'll have to send a letter and meet with a committee, and it's a more complicated process. With refusing, you just come to the military base on your conscription day, and if you're a public refuser like me, you might release a public statement before, and then after you tell them, I came and we had a protest, a demonstration, with the group of refusers that I was refusing with. There were 2 other young women my age who were refusing publicly and as conscientious objectors at the time. So we had a protest, and then I came and I told them I'm refusing to serve, and then they took me into arrest. They don't immediately take you into military prison. So I was in arrest for 3 days before I met with a judge. But it's all internal to the military. It's not truly a judge. It's just a soldier who's older and who has a high rank. So he becomes a judge, and then he gave me the sentence.
Fair and helpful, I think, for people to hear. I want to, in a bit, come back to a few different things you drew attention to, such as the fact that military refusal is outside of the parameters of the discourse, even in the most left wing of the mainstream Israeli electoral sphere. And I'm seeing a lot of questions in the chat also about how friends and family reacted, what the social repercussions are, and how that plays out. But Sahar, do you first want to share more from your experience a few years earlier about how things functioned and what it was like for you?
Yeah, I think I might actually take this opportunity to take a few steps back and maybe in that answer some of the questions about the kind of structures of how the system works.
Please.
So I mean, very basically speaking, right? There's mandatory military service, 2 years for women and 3 years for men, or a bit over two and a bit less than three at the moment. And this is theoretically, legally speaking, for all citizens of Israel. But as was asked in the chat, there is a large portion of Israeli citizens who are automatically exempt from military service, and those are Palestinians, right? 20% of the citizens of the state are automatically exempt. Um, just an interesting anecdote. There was an attempt in 1956, if I am not mistaken, to draft Palestinian citizens of Israel. The first day that this was done, and this is important to remember, 1956 is a period in which Palestinian citizens of Israel are still under martial law, just a few years after the 48 war and the Nakba. And so there's an attempt to draft them. They put up a camp in which people can come and enlist. And on the first day, they get 30,000 volunteers. And on that day, they realize maybe we don't actually want to arm 30,000 people that we are holding under military law, and have just displaced all of their communities and families. And did not revisit that idea. So that's just about the exemption of Palestinian citizens of Israel. The caveat to that are Druze. So Druze are a subsect of Islam that broke out of Islam in the 11th century. We're not going to get into that, but they are Arabs. Many of them do define themselves as Palestinian today. In 48, the vast majority of them define themselves as Palestinians, and throughout the 70s. But there has been a huge effort by the state to kind of, in this divide and conquer kind of way, to separate them from Palestinian identity. And today, the majority of Druze do not define themselves as Palestinians. Many of them don't even define themselves as Arabs. And part of that has also been conscription. So Druze men are conscripted into the military, and that's kind of the caveat to Palestinians, citizens of Israel being conscripted. So that's just that. And then it's also important to say that there's a lot of other ways out of military service. As Atalia said, one option is to try to declare yourself a conscientious objector, which is only for pacifists with a very narrow definition of what pacifism is. There's a military committee that decides if you are or not a pacifist. I failed the committee, so I'm not a pacifist, apparently. And mental health is the easiest way out of military service. Depending on the year, we're talking usually about 6 or 7% of Israeli society who don't start, and another similar percentage who don't finish military service on the grounds of mental health. That statistic is pretty high. So those are just as the ways to get out. And then for those who refuse publicly and do go to prison, like Atalia and myself, the prison that we go to is a military prison, which means a military prisons for soldiers, which is not the same as the military prisons for Palestinians, that are a whole other legal system. This is specifically only for soldiers to kind of get them back into being good soldiers. That is really all about discipline, structurally speaking. Most of the other inmates there are there for desertion, disobeying orders, mild drug use, and things of the sort. So just as kind of the atmosphere, it's not it's not like hardcore criminal. You're not in the civilian legal system. But what is important, I think, to say is that still, like any prison anywhere, it is filled by the marginalized parts of Israeli society. And so I can say that as a white person in that jail, the fact that I did not speak Russian was shocking to everyone around me. Like the assumption is the people who go into jail, including military prison, are either Russian immigrants, Mizrahi Jews, Jews from Arab countries, or Ethiopian. Like those are mainly the option. You have to be from a marginalized part of society to be in jail. Again, like anywhere in the world, it's true also in military prison. And in that way, those who are not are a bit of an anomaly to the system. So that's just about the experience of military prison itself, which I think is important because it again, like we're talking about the occupation. That's the main issue that we refuse around, but this all sits on a lot of other dynamics of racism and discrimination in this piece of land. between the river and the sea, that some of them also manifest within the military prison, within who is drafted and who is not, and systems of the sort. So I hope that answered some of the questions. And I'll just continue that to say post refusing, so beyond the actual experience of jail, there have been a lot of questions here in the chat and kind of some of the consequences. And the social consequences are some of them. I will just start with the legal ones. Theoretically, it is illegal in Israel to discriminate according to military service. The main reason for that are the fact that both Palestinian citizens of Israel, but also a lot of ultra-Orthodox Jews, don't serve in the military, which means that passing bills that will make it legal to discriminate is politically almost impossible. But de facto, people choose who they do and do not want to hire. And it's very clear that if you get two CVs, one of them served in the military and the other one didn't, and you yourself served in the military and feel like you gave up this and this time of your life, you're going to take the person who is the most like you, right? We know that as a discriminatory mechanism in all hiring around the world. And here, military is obviously part of that. Many people do ask about it, even if it's illegal. And there are also some more structured things. There's a lot of scholarships. There's better conditions in mortgages. There's higher taxation for people who didn't serve in the military. So there's a whole list of things that do affect you. But it is, I think, important to say that there's a much higher stigma. Like there's a kind of a conception that no one will hire you and you can't do anything. The reality is definitely not as bad. The reality, again, is also that the de facto over 50% of the citizens of this state do not serve in the military, right? Between Palestinian citizens and ultra-Orthodox and people who are exempt from military service and religious women and a whole long list, 50% of the citizens of the state do not serve in the military and they function. So yeah, just to say that is also true. The higher taxes, I'm just gonna respond to that directly. Yes, it does sound like a form of discrimination, but it's geared the other way around. The system here is one that you get kind of discount points on your taxes if you have done specific things. So if you're a resident, you pay slightly less taxes than if you don't live in the country. If you're a woman, you pay less taxes than if you're a man. If you're married, all kinds of things. One of them is completing military service. So that's, yeah. I don't think I answered the question at all, but I tried to answer a lot of other questions on the chat box. So
I think that was extremely helpful and opened up a lot of doors. One of the things you talked about or spoke about from your experience in military prison was being an anomaly for not speaking Russian, based around the general demographics of white inmates. Atalia, I guess I want to ask you also if you have anything you'd like to share about what the experience inside of the military prison was, what were dynamics like with the other prisoners, and in the context in which it's generally an anathema to refuse military service, how did other people relate to you, or what did that look like?
So, much like Sahar described, it like the stratification in society is very much mirrored in the military prison. There's like a high percentage of Ethiopians compared to their percentage in the general society. So I was like very, I guess, like unusual for the, but also I think politically I was very different, and I was very happy to be with women. I think it's like generally just a nice experience, and the conversations I had and sort of the friendships that I built there were actually very nice, and they made the experience much nicer for me. And sort of the way a lot of the other inmates reacted to my choice to refuse, and the way the army reacted to it was actually supportive, not in the sense that they thought I was like politically correct, but in the sense that a lot of them had mistrust of the system and this sort of urge to resist it. So they would, cheer me on with resisting the system. for me, it was very meaningful to have that. Yeah, and I think politically it was very interesting to see how many misconceptions there were about, what are Palestinians, what do their lives look like, what does it mean to be left wing. And I think being left wing right now is super demonized, and it was also very demonized back then. So a lot of people would tell me, you're okay, you're not like the real left wing people, which to me was very funny because you can really go much more left wing than refusing. Yeah.
Interesting, and meaningful to hear about. I've only heard you speak about your experience maybe once or twice before, but I think something I remember striking me one other time I heard you share about the experience. That maybe is just a minor detail, but do I remember right that you mentioned that sometimes the uniforms, the clothes that would be worn were surplus U.S. Army uniforms?
Always. There are always surplus
That was
US
always
Army uniform. Yeah. And it's not the Israeli military uniforms are, just like this olive green, but the uniforms that we had were we call it like menumarim. How do you call it in English?
camouflage camo.
Yeah. And I think what was sometimes you also had the name of the person, like Sergeant Jones or whatever on your shirt. Like it was
The U.S.
very
soldier officer?
obviously, yeah. Like
Wow.
it was a very obviously hand-me-downs from the US military.
There's a lot metaphorically and symbolically and materially to unpack there. So
Yeah.
how was that your experience too? I'm curious.
Yeah. It's specifically Desert Storm, like first Desert Storm, Iraq, first Iraq War. It's surpluses from there. The Israeli military received a lot of them. And one of the things, and so a lot of boot camps in Israel also use them, in the military and in military prisons.
Well, I've learned tremendously from Sahar and other people in this network about the arms industry and the fact that Israel receives, I believe it's 70% of imported weapons from the United States. So there's much there to discuss. But moving beyond your own personal experiences inside of military prison and to the network of refuses, the community that both of you have been part of building. I mean, I'm curious the ways that you might have interacted with refuser solidarity networks before, during, and after your own personal experiences. And then I'm just curious to hear more about the ways you've participated, what it's meant to you, why it's meaningful, and what kinds of activities, both in general and specifically over the last year, the Refuser Solidarity Network and related adjacent groups helped to organize. I don't know if Natalia, you want to begin with that.
Yeah. So when I chose to refuse, Mesarvot was very meaningful for me in the community it gave me, in the support, in the legal support. And Mesarvot is a group, a network of refusers who is supported partly by Refuser Solidarity Network in changing relations now, not so much, prior to that more. And when I refused, I at the like when you make that choice, you don't really know what to do. And I heard, on Facebook that there is this group, and I messaged them on Facebook, and then I met Tayer Kaminer, who was also a refuser, and like the ability to enter into a community of people who think the same way and who go through the same experience and who support each other was for me very meaningful, and it is still very meaningful. Like still my friends and my community are the same people who were with me when I refused. I currently live in an apartment with Tamar Alon, who refused the same time that I refused. So just having that is, I think, makes a whole lot of difference with like what is possible to do politically and what seems impossible. And right now, like, almost, I don't know, 8 years later, I work for Refuser Solidarity Network. and I manage their social media pages under the name Voices Against War. And a lot of what I do is this idea of just amplifying the voices of refusers, amplifying the voices of those who resist the occupation, who resist the assault on Gaza, who are for the past 15 months been calling for an immediate permanent ceasefire. And I do a lot of work just documenting and editing and posting, but also more personal work with activists about cooperation and about how do we create these campaigns trying to reach more people globally and internally. And also what Refusal Solidarity does is like more financially and legally support the new letter of refusers to Miluim service or reserve service. And I saw in the questions that somebody read about the letter and asked about that. So it's a group of reserve soldiers who decided that they are sort of declaring that they won't continue their reserve service as long as there's no hostage deal and ceasefire deal. And many of them are already stopped serving. I think most of them have already stopped their reserve service. And the message that they make publicly, I think, especially now, is very important because it is the soldiers that allow the Israeli government to cruelly attack and destroy and oppress.
Thanks, Natalia. And I think that the ways you're describing how community and the community of refusers, activists, and anti-occupation workers that surrounds makes it possible to do things that otherwise wouldn't be. Of course, in the context here, it would be very isolating if there wasn't other people with you because of the dominant narratives, and how the Refuser Solidarity Network, in conjunction with related movements, creates a space that's possible for people to act personally and politically and have a larger sphere to belong to is very powerful. Sahar, I'm curious to hear how that's been felt and experienced by you over your time being active in the network, having refused yourself, and if you can speak to your interactions with this community.
So I think, historically, one of the interesting things about kind of group refusal or organized refusal is that as early as the 80s, we already see group refusal letters of what we call feministim, which is seniors who come together during high school and decide that they will refuse publicly. And this tradition has continued, and for many years it was really just up to a group of seniors to come together and find each other in different ways. And sometimes it was from the same school or the same youth movement or the same political circles or anything of the sort. And in my period, that was still the case. So when I refused in 2008, there was a big refusal letter in 2001 and 2003 and 2005. And then the one that I was part of in 2008, that's how we kind of organized. And I think that it was very important for people to organize for two reasons. One of them is the support that Atalia was speaking about, and I'll speak a bit more to. And the other one is that there is a much larger political impact when you refuse as a group and make that statement. And I think that one of the things that became clear with time is that while there's something beautiful about this kind of organic gathering of seniors around this, it also means that if you don't know the right people, if you don't happen to be in circles where you meet others, you'll refuse without a community. And that, I think, is something that the creation of Mesalvot and kind of widening this infrastructure that can support refusers in different ways has been extremely important, and I think has changed a lot of kind of the landscape and allowed for people who were not part of large groups and so on to also refuse over the last decade. I think it is important to say that beyond refusers groups, generally the left here, the political left, has always given a lot of support to refusal. The first refusers here, just for the record, were in May 1948, as in as soon as there was a state, there was refusal to it, and to serve in the military. And that came initially mostly from the Communist Party. That has also been extremely important within the refusers movement throughout the years. Also of Jewish refusers, but also extremely important within the Druze refuser movement, which the vast majority of it, at least historically, came from the Communist Party. So just to say, there's a lot of other networks and structures who support refusers in different ways, and there always have been even before this specifically. From my own experience, something that has existed throughout all of these years since '98 is a group called New Profile, which really supported my refusal, which is a group that helps to this day refusers for military service for a variety of reasons. So not only refusers who choose to politically refuse and go to prison and make the political statement, but also people who choose to get out through mental health or conscientious objection all get counseling from this network. So again, there's a whole variety of structures that are there to support people who refuse. I think that, I mean, there's a reason to that, because people have been asking about the kind of social impact and cost and things like that, and the indoctrination that comes before military service. Those are huge and very, very strong powers. And to try to balance them, to try to give youth, and again, we're talking about, 18-year-olds, to give youth enough support to make this choice, even though this is what they've been indoctrinated to, even though in many cases their parents are very much opposed to them refusing, even though their classmates are all joining. Even with all of those evens those, you need to create some kind of alternative. And many times, I mean, it's very practical. Like we would joke that there's, kind of older refusers have a mattress at home that's waiting for the refuser that's kicked out of home and needs a place to stay. And that is also part of a reality.
Important. And I think just to bring in the voice of one of the refusers from the past year, one of the 18-year-olds Sahar just referred to, I'm going to quickly share my screen and show a video of Sophia O being interviewed on Al Jazeera. She speaks about her own experience and decision, and also touches on the Refuser Solidarity Network and the community that supported her to make the decision she did and be true to her ethical compass. One moment.
Well, let's bring in now Sophie Or. Sophie is supposed to enlist in the Israeli army, but is refusing to do so. She joins us from Pardes Hana in Israel. Good to have you with us. So first of all, let me ask you, why did you take the decision to refuse to enlist?
Well, I made the decision to refuse before the war. I made that decision because I refused to take part in the IDF's violent policies of oppression and apartheid, and to be part of this endless cycle of bloodshed. I choose to refuse because there is no military solution to a political problem, and now with the war that has become more apparent than ever. And so my refusal is more important to me than ever. And I choose to refuse in a very public way, in hope to reach the Israeli society, especially young people, to show them that refusing is an option, and that peace is an option, the only option. Because there are 7 million Palestinians here and 7 million Israeli Jews here, and no one is going anywhere.
Are you worried about how receptive the public will be to your message, given the militarization of society, given the push to the right that's going on?
Indeed, Israeli society is an extremely militaristic one, and refusing is absolutely not an accepted thing. And I am called a traitor, a self-hating Jew. I get wishes for me to be raped or killed. And since the war started, it has gotten worse. There has been a shift to the right, and the right was already strong. And there also has been repression of activists in the radical left, especially Palestinians with Israeli citizenship, but also Israeli Jews. So I am worried, but it's worth it, because if only one person is going to hear my words and they will make them think, then it's worth it, and I'm willing to endure the consequences of that.
Given everything you've just said and the sort of calls that you're facing, it must take a lot of conviction to take the position you've taken. How concerned are you about the prospect of facing almost an endless cycle of court appearances and jail terms, right? That's what you could be looking at.
I am concerned, of course. It's a scary experience. But I do have the support of the Mesorvot network, which also supports Tal Mitnick, that was just sent to prison. And they accompany us on this process, and it does help a lot. But of course, it's scary, and I don't know how much time, and it can be different now with the war, because the political sphere in Israel has changed and gone in a dramatic shift to the right. But as I said before, I'm concerned, but it is worth it, and I stand with my decisions and my morals all the way.
I remember it being very moving for me when I first saw that interview, I believe in December of 2023, if I'm not mistaken. And I found it very moving the way she talks about the network of refusers that accompanied her in the process and is still accompanying her, and many others accompanying each other to the present moment. I guess I want to ask Atalia and Sahal if you want to share anything more about this last period in specific since October 7th, 2023, and what is the same or what has shifted for the Refuser Solidarity Network and for refusers in general. People have asked in the chat, has there been an uptick in refuser? Are there more? Are the activities different or the same? People were able to see some of the demonstrations, the jail support demonstrations, and showings in the bottom left corner of the screen, I believe, just now. But yeah, please share more about this last period and what it's been like in this community and for the sphere of activism.
So I can start. So this past period for my work in the Refuser Solidarity Network has been really a period of intense work. I think we really this year or this past 15 months, we really extended our efforts and what we do. Like the Voices Against War page is something that we started on October, because we really thought, like, because anti-war activists were already starting to demonstrate against what is happening in Gaza in October and November, December. Like, this sense of something awful is happening was already there, and also a lot of us are, familiar with the state of Israel and what we can do, and we sort of knew the disaster that was going to happen, and so we were already there, already speaking out against it, and for me and for my partners in the Refuser Solidarity Network, it was really important to create this platform and to reach really a wide audience, and to invest a lot of energy in trying to uplift the resistance to the occupation. So it was really, and also I think a lot of what we do is solidarity work with Palestinian partners, and this period was especially dangerous for them. And really, since October 7th, it became really, really terrifying for Palestinians in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, of course in Gaza, but cannot enter. But there were just a lot of very violent settler attacks. Many communities who had to leave and to escape. So a lot of what I did at the time was a lot of protective presence, which is this practice of sort of using our privilege of as Jewish Israelis to be present in these villages, in these homes where settlers are attacking, where the military is attacking, and trying to use our privilege to document, to prevent certain situations. And I think we sort of became more powerless, but still effective at even just in giving solidarity and maybe a sense of security, even if we can't really do something. And we started also, the project with the reserve soldiers, and a project for like mental health support for activists. Really, I think this period demanding of us to be very, very active and like very constantly doing things and starting projects and trying to do whatever we can to show that we are here, we are resisting.
Thank you. And really amazing to hear about the community of care and coordination and accompaniment that exists and that you've been part of building. And I think to hear about the ways that this community is supporting each other to radically refuse participation in military occupation and violence, and supporting each other to use privilege against itself in refusal, in protective presence, and solidarity accompaniment with Palestinians in Area C, shepherds, farmers, etc., in so many different ways. Sahar, do you want to add anything about this last period in specific and what things have looked like?
Yeah, I think generally always there's been this kind of conversation within the refuser movement of needing to widen the refusal movement in two different ways. One of them is widening the amount of people refusing military service, and the other one is widening the question of what does it mean to refuse, and that it's not just a thing that you do when you're 18 for a few months and so on, and that refusal is refusing generally to participate in occupation, to cooperate with it. And part of that is resistance and a lot of the work that Atalia was speaking about. And I think that in this period, one of the very interesting things that I think is worth noting that while the amount of people refusing military service because of the war is growing, it is still not significant numbers. It's still not going to end the war. But there are a lot of people doing this, both conscripts, but even more than that, reserve service refusers. And most of them are not doing it publicly. Most of them, while there are a few public letters, the vast majority are not doing it publicly. And the reason for that is that the public kind of discourse is so militaristic that a lot of people, even if they don't want to do this themselves, they don't want to be in the spotlight of this. But I think what's also very interesting is the discussions that I hear happening within less radical circles, within the Zionist left, within the circles that are fighting, that their main issue is currently around ending the war, but for the sake of the hostages. And that in that space, there are quite a lot of people who are saying at this point that they understand that the most effective thing that they can do politically is refuse. For the hostages' sake, without even going anything further than that. And they don't. And a lot of them are people who, they'll gladly get arrested every week. They'll go block all the roads. Like, it's not that they can do radical action. They understand that activism requires action. And yet this is a line that is too hard for them to cross. And it's interesting to hear them speak about it because they say, we understand that this is how you end a war. And we understand that if this camp that goes out every Saturday night and demands a hostage deal with the end of the war, which was not true a year ago, but today they will say, we demand a full deal, including the end of a war. If that camp was to refuse, the war would be over. They wouldn't have to go every Saturday night to protest. And a lot of them understand that and still don't do it. And I think that that is one of the crucial things to understand about. I think it's true in many societies, but it's definitely true here. Is that obedience? Like we know this line of saying, you know, that the evil prevails because good people don't act, or like this kind of the obedience is what allows for things to happen, and you don't have to do something bad. You just need to go with the flow. And I think that this is a really clear example of how strong that obedience is. And I think that that's a challenge for all of us to ask, really, how do you do that? How do you push further um, of our own obediences wherever we are? And I think a lot of us, I mean, there's the context of here, but we all have our own context of political repression wherever we are. Those of you in the US, you know, have 4 years at least to do some very hardcore refusal to cooperate with this, but not only those in the US and a lot of other countries that are represented here. And I think that's kind of a question that I think is important for all of us to ask ourselves, to learn from each other, to give each other idea of how do we push, first of all, ourselves to really refuse to cooperate with these systems, and secondly, this other circle of people who understand, have their hearts in the right place, but who don't know how to make that move, that further step of saying, even if this is a social taboo, we have to be crossing it. Among other things, because the other side is crossing every social taboo possible all the time.
Thanks, and something I think is really powerful for me about the work that both of you do and the ways I've seen you move in justice work is the ways you relate to refusal and solidarity as ongoing practices. It's not that you both were refusers in 2008 and 2017, respectively, and that was your moment of refusal. You've been part of communities and movements and networks who have worked to expand the possibilities of solidarity and refusal every day. And this is true for all of us all over the world. We have to work every day and practice refusal and practice not allowing ourselves to be conscripted into projects of patriarchy, militarism, geopolitical domination, war. This is true everywhere. So I'm curious, because as always, we're running a bit over time, maybe to ask you to end on that note and share any thoughts you have about lessons from the Refuser Network you've been a part of that you think are valuable for communities around the world trying to counter militarism and their own government's complicity in occupation. Taya, do you want to share any thoughts?
I think it's an interesting question. I think one of the things sort of becoming a refuser really allows me mentally was to like really step out of conformity and to be like more, it's like very like whole with myself about what I think is right and what I think is wrong, and like with a lot of the people that I used to sort of be in community with when I was in the sort of Zionist left-wing movement was this like, you constantly see this like cognitive dissonance. And I think it's really similar to what Sal described with like people who know that refusing would give them the tool to change the things they want to change, and it would give them the tool to end the war, to get a hostage deal, but they still don't do it because there's still, I think, this not only obedience, but really cognitive dissonance about what our society is and what are the important things. And still the military is like the most important thing. And like, it's where you become a citizen. It's where you become an adult. And I think they have these like constant like inner disagreements and like political like paradoxes almost. And I think for me, once I made this like really sort of harsh decision, and this decision to like step out of my community, of my society, it allowed me to be way more honest with myself about how I see Zionism and how I see Israel, and to be also more honest in my political actions and my political views. So I think that's one lesson, maybe.
Thanks.
I think another lesson I would suggest, and this is going to be a contradiction, I'm going to contradict myself in this sentence. I think one of the things that can be learned from refusal generally is about pushing ourselves and our community in the context of how much are we willing, how much privilege are we willing to sacrifice, and how, and pushing the boundaries of that. And part of that is understanding we have a lot of privilege that has, for those of you who do, obviously that's not everyone, that comes with a responsibility to push those boundaries. And an agreement that you will pay a price. And the contradicting piece of advice is to also remember that we are here for the long run, and that part of that is making sure that people that we don't heroize sacrifice, definitely not for the sake of sacrifice, that we allow people to do things that are outside of their comfort zone. I'm not saying people should not stay in their comfort zone, but that are still safe for them, and that allow them to continue to be activists over time. So those are a bit of a contradiction, but I think that is something that is possible to hold both of those things at the same time. And so, and a lot of that is about community, is about building a community that says, yes, we will be, pushing ourselves, including our bodies, including all of those things. And at the same time, we will be taking care of each other and taking care of our needs, both physical and mental and financial. And, if we're talking about prisoner support, wherever you are in the world, of things like that, like it has a lot of aspects. And I think that is a way to kind of hold those two contradictory things together.
Thanks. And thanks to you both for all your invaluable insight and all of the perspective about the work that's being done to allow people in the context you're in to step more and more fully into more full, vibrant, robust networks of solidarity, refusal, and support as part of wider movements against the occupation and towards collective liberation. With that, unfortunately, we're out of time for today. And if there's one thing I've learned is that we should have more conversations like this soon, and there's so much more to discuss. But endless thanks, Sahab and Natalia, for joining us, and thanks also to each of you here on behalf of the Green Olive Collective and the Refuser Solidarity Network for joining this event from around the world. As I mentioned at the start of our time, we depend on contributions from you, our wider community, to cover the cost of our events and sustain solidarity projects with Palestinian communities facing unprecedented state violence, settler attacks, and expropriation of land. You can contribute at greenolivetours.com/contributions, which I just put into the chat. Today's contributions will be split with the Refuser Solidarity Network and also sustain their invaluable work challenging militarism, amplifying the voices of Israeli military resistors, and providing them with critical services, including jail support, legal aid, community care, and a platform to publicly refuse to participate in military occupation. Your contributions will sustain community projects in the West Bank, in communities Sahab, Atalia, and I work with in Masaka Yatta and the Jordan Valley, such as replanting olive trees after arson attacks by settlers, community gardens on lands threatened with expropriation, and rebuilding homes after demolitions. They will allow us to develop global campaigns and sustain direct support for communities facing displacement in Area C. The Green Olive Collective is hosting 3 solidarity missions in 2025, advancing solidarity across borders and a democratic future. Anyone who wants to meet myself and incredible human rights defenders in Area C, and Israeli human rights defenders like Sahar and Natalia is welcome, of course, to join and learn more at greenislandtours.com. And with that, we hope everyone here has good and peaceful days. And we send all of our support to all of you around the world calling for justice. We will send a recording of this event tomorrow to everyone who registered and attended, and we'll see you soon. Much thanks and have good days.
Thank you very much for having us, and thank you all for listening.